Hi, I'm Anthony Accatatta. I served aboard the Harwood starting in December of 1959 until July of 1963. That's a bit unusual. Usually you only stay about 2 years, but I was fortunate enough to stay with the ship through a major yard overhaul. What I intend to do is to provide a brief history of the Harwood and of some of the ports she visited and some of the activities that she was involved in. This is the history of the USS Harwood, DD/DDE 861. The Harwood DD 861 is a Gearing-class destroyer that was the last combatant ship built by Bethlehem Steel Corporation at their San Pedro, California shipyard. The ship is named for Commander Bruce Lawrence Harwood, a heroic aviator who was killed while leading a firefighting party aboard the USS Princeton, CVL-23, when that vessel was under attack by enemy Japanese aircraft during the Second Battle of the Philippine Sea on 24 October 1944. Commander Harwood was awarded the Navy Cross and the Purple Heart Medal posthumously. The ship is his legacy. The ship's keel was laid on 28 October 1944, launched on 22 May, and was commissioned 28 September 1945, just 6 weeks after World War II ended. For the first 3.5 years of her life, the ship operated with the Pacific Fleet and was home ported at San Diego, California. The Harwood made 2 Far East cruises, during which she visited ports in China, Japan, Korea, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Okinawa. Between these 2 cruises, she underwent 3 months overhaul at the Bremerton, Washington shipyard in late 1947. In January of 1949, she entered Mare Island Shipyard in California for an 8-month overhaul. At this time, the most modern anti-submarine equipment then known was added to the ship. She was redesignated as an escort destroyer because of her ASW capabilities. Subsequently, she was transferred to the Atlantic Fleet, arriving at her new home port, Newport, Rhode Island. This was via the Panama Canal in August of 1949. For the next 6 months, the Harwood conducted various short exercise cruises in the Atlantic, visiting Key West and Bermuda. In March of 1950, the ship participated in Operation Portex in the Caribbean, one of the first large post-World War II anti-submarine hunter-killer operations. After another period of local operations, the ship became part of the Operation Development Task Force that was involved with the establishment of cold weather operational methods. She visited Argentia, Newfoundland, and Reykjavik, Iceland, and steamed north of the Arctic Circle, giving her crew their first experience with continuous daylight. After an upkeep period, Harwood made her first Mediterranean cruise, joining the 6th Fleet in September of 1950. In the Mediterranean, she visited ports in Sicily, Malta, and the French Riviera. In January of 1951, she provided plane guard services for the light carrier Monterey off Pensacola, Florida, and as an anti-submarine school ship in Key West. She then went to a 5-month Navy Yard overhaul. After a brief period of competitive exercises, the Harwood proceeded to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba for the post-6-week period of refresher training designed to test her battle readiness and the quality of her yard work. Following her return to Newport, she participated in a major Atlantic Fleet operation entitled Landflex, and then spent Christmas holidays in her new home port. In January of '52, the ship departed for a 3-month Mediterranean cruise, during which she visited ports in France, Italy, and North Africa. On her return, she became a unit of the Atlantic Hunter-Killer Forces, whose operation took her to the North Atlantic, where she had a short trip to Greenock, Scotland, and to subarctic waters off of Norway. By autumn, she was operating off Newport, and she spent the Christmas period in Fall River, Massachusetts. In February of '53, the ship began her third tour of duty with the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, where she participated in 2 months of exercises with the navies of other NATO nations. Late spring was spent in Boston Naval Shipyard, after which the Harwood won her third straight Battle Efficiency Award, the Navy E, during refresher training at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. During the fall of '53, she conducted destroyer exercises off Newport, again spending the winter holiday moored at Fall River, Mass. In the spring of '54, the Harwood engaged in Operation Springboard. This is a month-long Caribbean cruise, including air defense and anti-submarine exercises. On this cruise, the ship visited San Juan, Puerto Rico, St. Thomas, the Virgin Islands, and Ciudad Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. After Springboard, she conducted local hunter-killer operations and prepared for a 4.5-month Mediterranean tour, which began in September. On this trip, the Harwood covered the entire length of the Mediterranean Sea, going as far east as Emir, Turkey, and Beirut, Lebanon. In January of '55, she returned to her home port. The ship came under operational command of the Atlantic Anti-Submarine Forces. Employment with this command occupied the next 9 months. The ship then acted as an engineering school for Atlantic destroyer personnel, and for the remainder of 1955 followed a 3-month yard period in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. After that, the usual subsequent refresher training at Guantanamo Bay was conducted. Later, midshipmen from the Naval Academy and universities with naval ROTC units embarked in the Harwood for a 2-month summer cruise in the Eastern Atlantic, during which time she visited Barcelona, Spain, and Dublin, Ireland. In the early winter of 1956, she completed an anti-submarine patrol for Russian submarines in the North Atlantic. This was incident to the Russian invasion of Hungary. Harwood departed Newport, one of a division of 3 DDEs, and together with a submarine proceeded south to Havana, Cuba for a short recreational stop. Interrupted one Sunday morning when several busloads of Fidel Castro's rebels attempted to shoot up the then President Batista's presidential palace. After a brief stop in Panama, Harwood transited the Panama Canal and proceeded south to the old Spanish main port of Cartagena, Colombia, for a goodwill visit, and then further south to Salinas, Ecuador, Callao, Peru, and Valparaiso, Chile, for joint anti-submarine warfare training exercises with these nations. She then returned to Newport in early spring of 1957. At the end of that 3-month cruise, a visit to Bermuda precluded a Mediterranean cruise, which occupied the next 5 months of the year 1957. Operations in the Atlantic and the Caribbean, interspersed with upkeep periods, a yard period in Boston, and training at Guantanamo Bay, laid the groundwork for the ship's assignment to Task Group Bravo. The mission of this group was to develop new anti-submarine tactics to augment World War II methods. Few people know that the Navy maintained ready ASW groups to protect our coast from unfriendly submarines. One such group was Task Group Bravo. The Harwood operated with this task group, which alternated with Task Group Alpha patrolling our east coast, so that at all times the coast was protected with either task group during this period. At this time, the Harwood was operating with the aircraft carrier Wasp. Fire broke out on the hangar deck of the Wasp, and the Harwood was the first ship on scene to assist in putting out the fire. After several hours, the fire was brought under control, and the Harwood continued to stand by the carrier. While operating with Task Group Bravo, a combination NATO exercise and midshipman cruise was made in conjunction with the Canadian and British navies. The St. Lawrence Seaway was just opened in July 1959, and the ship was able to visit Quebec, Canada. She spent early fall engaged in Landflex 59, an all-Atlantic fleet operation. The winter of 59 and 60 was spent in local operations with a month at Newport for the Christmas leave period. In March of 1960, the Harwood again deployed to the Caribbean, and in April had her first taste of operations against a nuclear submarine, the Skipjack. After a brief NATO operation with Canadian forces, the ship departed from Norfolk with 20 midshipmen for the Mediterranean Midshipman Cruise of 1960. During this cruise, the Harwood experienced the largest single gathering of warships since World War II. This occurred in Gulf de Palma Bay in Sardinia. The ship returned to Newport in late August, then engaged in independent steaming and destroyer exercises, closing out 1960 with a visit to Miami, where the ship and crew represented the fleet at the annual Orange Bowl game. The game was between Navy and Missouri. Part of the crew was able to enjoy the game and other festivities associated with it. In early January of '61, she exercised with the nuclear submarine Robert E. Lee. After a short period in Boston Navy Yard, the ship escorted Polaris-carrying submarines while the subs test-fired the Polaris missiles. This was done off Cape Canaveral, with the Harwood acting as the security vessel. The remainder of the spring of '61 was spent preparing for entry into New York Naval Shipyard for the Fleet Rehabilitation and Modernization Program, designated FRAM. During this time, the crew was involved with stripping the ship of weapons and systems that were no longer needed for the fulfillment of the FRAM program. The program consisted of virtually rebuilding the ship from the hull up, and was designed to increase the life of many destroyers built during World War II by 6 to 8 years. On 2 May of '61, the Harwood entered the yard, and the FRAM overhaul was started, and it lasted exactly 9 months. During the time, the profile of the ship was substantially altered. During this time, only a skeleton crew remained on the ship to learn the new equipment and to train the new crew when they came aboard. Among other changes, the bridge was totally reconstructed, new types of torpedo tubes were installed, depth charges and K-guns were removed, and accommodations were made for a hangar and launching deck for the Dash anti-submarine drone helicopter. Upon completion, on January 1962, the home port was changed from Newport, Rhode Island to Mayport, Florida. The ship left the yards on 2nd of February of '62 and spent one last week at Newport, where the married members of the crew made arrangements to move their families to Mayport. On 12 February '62, the Harwood arrived at her new home port, Mayport, Florida. 1 week later, proceeded to Guantanamo Bay for her most rigorous period of refresher training to date. 3 days in Kingston, Jamaica provided a short break, and the ship returned to Mayport on 15 of April. Leaving for her latest Mediterranean cruise on the 22nd of May of '62, stopped at Rota, Spain for 2 days, and passing through Gibraltar on 3 June, this cruise provided to be her most extensive to date for its voyage to the Middle East. This involved 2 transits of the Suez Canal and took the ship as far east as Karachi, Pakistan, 10,000 miles from Mayport. She returned to the home port on 12 October. Other ports visited were Djibouti, French Somaliland, Aden, Bahrain, Aqaba, Jordan, Gulf Juan, France, Naples, Italy, and Catania, Sicily. As a side note, at this time, the Harwood, along with all other escort destroyers, were redesignated a General Purpose Destroyer, a DD. Upon returning to Mayport, the long-awaited period of leave and upkeep was abruptly interrupted by the Cuban Missile Crisis. On only 4 hours' notice, the ship got underway for the Caribbean on 26 October, leaving 45 of the crew on shore. All of these were flown to the ship within 10 days. It was one of the first ships on the line to help enforce the blockade of Russian ships going to Cuba. Upon successful negotiations by President Kennedy, and after a month of near continuous steaming, the issues were settled and the ship returned to Mayport on 21 November, just in time for the Thanksgiving season. The ship then provided plane guard services for the carrier Lexington for 2 weeks, and then the ship moored at Mayport for upkeep and Christmas leave on 10 December. In January, the ship departed for another Caribbean cruise, starting with a port call in Puerto Rico. On Sunday, 27 January, the Harwood was moored in Ponce, Puerto Rico. In early afternoon, the quarterdeck was informed that the coastal freighter, the William Johnson, a general cargo ship of 1,700 tons out of Nassau, was entering port with her ensign upside down, a distress signal, and it was requesting aid. The ship was rapidly flooding from the forward cargo hold aft. The Harwood's damage control party was called away to render assistance. The ship was flooding at a rate of 300 gallons per minute through a rusted-out seam in the forward hull. By using pumps and sealing the leaks, the damage control party was able to quell the flooding until it was brought under control. The ship was carrying cement, which was then used to further contain the flooding by mixing it with the remaining water and applying it to the damaged area. The William Johnson left for Barbados the next morning under these temporary repairs. After operating in the Caribbean for the first half of '63, the ship was designated a secondary recovery ship for the Mercury astronaut missions in early 1963. After the Mercury astronaut program, the Harwood left on 3 August for another Mediterranean cruise and visited the following ports: Gulf de Palmas, Arancia Bay, Sardinia, Palermo, Sicily, Naples, Messina, and Livorno, Italy, Gulf Juan and Saint Raphael in France, Pollenza Bay, Majorca, and Valletta, Malta. The Harwood returned to Mayport, Florida on 23 December 1963. On 1 May of '64, she left for another midshipman cruise, stopping at Oslo, Norway, Antwerp, Belgium, Southampton, England, and Le Havre, France. The ship returned to Mayport in August of 1966. In that same month, it departed again for her 9th Med cruise with ports of call included in Thiers-sur-Mer, France, Naples, Italy, and Beirut, Lebanon. After a brief visit at Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, the Harwood was treated to a real taste of British hospitality. She visited Aden, Bahrain, and Mombasa, Kenya. The latter port proved to be the most interesting, where the officers and crew were treated to a tour of the Salvo National Game Preserve on the way to Mombasa. Harwood crossed the equator at 45 degrees 0 minutes, and in true Navy tradition, 230 polywogs were initiated into the Royal Order of Shellbacks. Transiting the Suez Canal on 2 November 1966, the Harwood rejoined the Sixth Fleet for a week of operations before making visits to Naples and Genoa, Italy, for some well-needed rest and liberty. The ship received the Desron 16 Battle Efficiency E-1 in fiscal 1966, and the Operations E for Departmental Excellence. A brief 5-day visit to the exciting city of Barcelona, Spain, was made prior to departing the Med. The ship arrived in its home port of Mayport on 17 December. In early 1967, she operated out of Mayport, Florida, and the East Coast until sailing on her 10th Mediterranean deployment on 29 June 67, reaching Rota, Spain on 10 July. The Harwood joined the Sixth Fleet, an element of stability in the ancient and volatile sea, which had so recently been churned up by the Arab War with Israel. The Harwood deployed to Vietnam on 10 April of 68. After transiting the Panama Canal and a brief but enjoyable stay in San Diego and Pearl Harbor, the Harwood, the lone wolf of Desron 14, began her long journey across the Pacific to Subic Bay, Republic of the Philippines. There she underwent a short upkeep and preparation before leaving for Vietnam and the gun line. Naval gunfire support off the coast of South Vietnam was her primary duty. She spent time on the gun line in support of our troops ashore, destroying or damaging 410 enemy bunkers and structures, neutralizing numerous storage and assembly areas, and accounting for many confirmed enemy casualties. In this effort, the Navy Gunfire Support Officer, working for the 1st Marine Division and directing the Harwood's targeting, was a former First Lieutenant on the Harwood. In addition, the Harwood operated off the coast of North Vietnam in Operation Sea Dragon, during which time she worked with the USS Berkeley in a massive interdiction of enemy waterborne logistics craft, WLBC. It was described as one of the heaviest offshore bombardments of the war. 58 WBLCs were either destroyed or damaged by the Harwood Berkeley team. Of these, 36 were officially credited to the Harwood. On 5 separate occasions, the ship was taken under fire by enemy coastal defenses, and in one instance received a hit in her after gun mount, inflicting 2 personnel casualties and resulting in 2 Purple Hearts and 1 Bronze Star awarded to Harwood crew members. During this deployment, the Harwood fired over 10,000 rounds of 5-inch projectiles, destroying bunkers, structures, caves, and waterborne logistic vessels. Not all of Harwood's recognition came from combat action. While refueling at sea, the ship made an emergency breakaway from the oiler and launched her motor whaleboat and recovered a man lost overboard from the USS Tripoli, LPH-10. The sailor, who was unconscious, was rescued by the Harwood only 8 minutes after being knocked overboard. Harwood also served a total of 4 weeks plane guarding for the attack carriers USS Bonhomme Richard, USS America, and the nuclear-powered USS Enterprise. She steamed over 60,000 miles while operating at sea 75% of the time, and had an enviable record of meeting every operational commitment on time during the tour of duty. Harwood was placed in reduced operating status for a period of 5 months when she returned to Mayport in late '68. During this time, her crew and operating schedule was reduced to a bare minimum. In May 1969, the Harwood entered the Charleston Naval Shipyard for 4 months of scheduled repair and maintenance. In July, she changed home ports again, moving to Charleston, South Carolina. In November 1969, the Harwood steamed south to Guantanamo Bay for 10 weeks of grueling refresher training. Following a brief period in Charleston, South Carolina, she returned to the Caribbean for 5 weeks in support of Operation Springboard. After another short stay in Charleston, Harwood began a stormy spring journey across the Atlantic to start her 10th Mediterranean cruise. During this 1970 Med deployment, Harwood distinguished herself in operation with carriers, oilers, and other destroyers. She was part of the effective show of United States strength in the Eastern Mediterranean during the September 1970 Middle East crisis. Also during this time, the Harwood participated with other NATO forces in exercises off the coast of Greece. The Harwood was loaned to Turkey 17 December 1971 and was decommissioned and stricken from the rolls on 1 February 1973. On February 15, 1973, Harwood was officially transferred to the Turkish Navy and renamed TCS Accatatta. Harwood's last U.S. commanding officer was Captain Robert M. Marshall, USN. On 22 July 1974, a tragic military blunder occurred during a brief conflict with Greece over the islands of Cyprus. A Turkish Air Force plane bombed and sank the Accatatta. The Turkish Air Force plane had mistakenly identified it as a Greek destroyer and thought it was part of an invading force from Greece. The Accatatta was sunk and 80 Turkish sailors lost their lives. The ship lies at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, southwest of the island of Cyprus. Subsequently, the Turkish Navy requested and received permission for the replacement of the Accatatta with the USS Norris, and that ship was renamed Accatatta. I have presented the 29-year history of the USS Harwood DD 861 in as concise a period of time that will give a flavor of what a typical destroyer active duty years were like. The legacy of the Harwood is one of service to the United States and is indicative of the same service that was provided by many other ships of this type. They were all dedicated to the defense of the country and were a deterrent to our enemies. This history is dedicated to Bruce Lawrence Harwood and the many men that served her during her lifetime. Thank you very much.